Welcome back everyone to the start of the second unit for the semester. Today we're going to begin exploring Chapter 5. This chapter focuses on pretrial supervision in jails. This unit is going to be focusing on the concrete aspects of the correctional system rather than the abstract issues that we were looking at the first unit. Let's go ahead and get started by looking at the bail and bond process that occurs post-arrest. To begin with, we have to discuss what bail and bond actually are. These two words are interchangeable, but they're not exactly the same thing at all. To say that someone was released on bail is incorrect. Bail is a type of agreement that is reached, but not the actual form of release. Because bail is based on statutory categories, there is normally a set amount for specific crimes. But the type of bail agreement can change based on mitigating or aggravating circumstances that occur with the offense. Bail basically means that in exchange for something, I give you a signature or money or some sort of collateral, I promise to show up for my court hearings. If I don't show up, then I forfeit whatever I promised to the court and I will be arrested. Bond, on the other hand, is the actual payment for the bail. So this is the method in which I am actually released. You can be released on your own recognizance, which does not require cash or collateral. That is the best case scenario, but not entirely frequent. Someone could bond you out. I might not have to put anything down, but if you run, then I am responsible for the bond amount if you do run. You could also put up cash or collateral in a secured bond as well. If you cannot afford the bond amount, then you may be required to utilize the services of a bondsperson. In that instance, you would make an agreement with the bondsman instead of the court. The bondsman is responsible for the money if you run, which is why they normally use a bounty hunter if you do. I actually want to take the opportunity to show you a real bond agreement that was used by officers working at the Federal Pretrial Services Office for the Middle District of Florida. This is actually a federal bond, so let me go ahead and pull this up for you. This is an example of a co-signed unsecured bond in which the defendant was released on a $100,000 bond. In order for it to be unsecured, the defendant, and in this case the defendant's parents, did not have to put up collateral for the bond. This case involved a very young defendant. He was only 21 years old at the time of the offense. He was arrested and indicted for possession with intent to distribute narcotics. I'm not going to give you too many facts about this case as this is a redacted bond agreement. You can see here on this first page that the defendant has signed an unsecured bond. It's a signature bond worth $100,000, as I just said. On this second page, you can actually see the conditions for the bond release, where it says here, these are just the standard conditions, and then we get down to the actual conditions, or additional conditions of release. So for his additional conditions, these are also pretty standard for a federal bond release case. The defendant has to surrender his passport, as you can see here on 21014. The defendant also has to maintain employment. He cannot have a firearm, and this is going to continue after his conviction took place for the felony charges. He cannot have drugs, and he will be drug tested. This is pretty common, especially for a drug defendant. He was not placed on any sort of electronic monitoring, but he does have travel restrictions, as you can see at the very bottom of this page, in which he has to stay within the geographical confines of the Fort Myers area. You can see that here. On the next page, let's get to that. Okay, so the next page has even further conditions that the defendant may or may not be required to abide by. So on this page, this is going to show the requirements for the drug testing that are checked off right here. And if there is a curfew, which this individual does have, and that's at the very bottom of this page, the supervision officer has to randomly call the defendant to make sure that he or she, but he in this case, is abiding by the conditions of that curfew. So he has to be in the house subjected to curfew from 7 p.m. to 6 a.m. every single day. If the defendant breaks the curfew or tests positive for a narcotic substance, The supervision officer can then go to the judge and ask the judge to revoke the bond, and the defendant can go to jail until his court hearings. This page actually shows additional conditions that this specific offender did not have to abide by, but are available for other bond defendants. In that case, where is it? It is actually on this next page here. If you look here, the defendant shall not have any computer or internet access. This is an additional supervision condition that is especially sort of extended, if you will, towards sex offender defendants. Subjected to mental health evals, these individuals are deemed a sex offender defendant and they are given a condition of no internet. This is specifically true at the federal level for child porn defendants. That's the most common type of sex offender defendant that the federal government sees. On this final page, you can see here that it talks to the defendant about what happens if the defendant violates the terms of his bond. But on the final page here, let's get to this. The final page shows the defendant that if he were to do anything that violates the terms of the bond agreement, then the bond is going to be revoked and any assets will be forfeited. In this case, the family will have to come up with $100,000 for the bond because the defendant violated the terms of the bond. As I stated before, the defendant's parents co-signed on the bond, and you can see here, even though it's redacted, that everybody signed and agreed to the terms of the bond release. So now let me get back into our PowerPoints. And now we're back in our PowerPoints to discuss the actual supervision process that takes place with pretrial services. So pretrial supervision is maintained by pretrial services officers. We just discussed in the federal bond, but there are state and local pretrial offices. So they would supervise offenders that commit a state or local offense. The bigger pretrial units are located in bigger areas. That makes sense. And some pretrial services agencies are in combined offices with probation. But your officers either serve a pretrial or probation function only. Post-arrest, pretrial services officers are the first interactions that a defendant will have with the court system. Defendants are now under the supervision of the court, even though they may be held in custody at the local jail. Pretrial officers encounter a lot of the same issues with defendants that the arresting officers and jail officials do. There are issues with mental illness. Pretrial officers are trained to look for mental illness issues. They ask the defendant about any medications that he or she might be taking, and if they suspect that this is a mental illness defendant, then they can recommend a further psych eval or can recommend diverting the defendant elsewhere if appropriate. We will talk more about diversion in the next chapter. With domestic violence cases, they can even recommend that the defendant be denied access to the victim. They can recommend that he or she start counseling or make no alcohol or drug use a condition that has to be, if that was a factor in the case. They can subject that defendant to drug or alcohol testing. Pretrial supervision also involves drug testing, as I just mentioned. Defendants may be required to submit to drug or alcohol testing as a condition of the supervised release. This is especially true for drug defendants or those who were using drugs at the time of the offense. If they fail these drug tests, then their bond may be revoked and they would go back to jail to await the rest of their court proceedings. Just like our friend that we examined in the bond release document, he was charged with a drug offense, so it makes sense that that was one of his additional conditions. In order for a defendant to be released on bond, they need to meet certain criteria or they will not be released. That criteria starts to be examined once the bond interviews actually begin. Those typically take place before the defendant's first appearance in court. During those interviews, the pretrial officer is looking at the risk factors of the defendant, and they are included in the recommendations of these officers. These recommendations are handed to judges, and those individuals then make the final determination of release. There are three main factors that pretrial officers look at when they make a bond recommendation. The first is the danger risk. That involves looking to see if you are charged with a violent crime, if you had a history of violent crimes in your past, if you committed a dangerous or serious crime, then pretrial release really isn't looking like a very good option for you. If you are a danger to yourself or to others, then it is unlikely that you're going to be released on bond. Secondly, we have the recidivism risk factor. This looks at your criminal history to see if you have been active in the past. After all, the best predictor of our future behaviors is our past behaviors. If you have been rearrested for a crime when you are currently serving a sentence for a previous crime, then you're probably not going to be released. The more extensive your criminal history, the less likely it is that you're going to be released on bond. Or if you are lucky to be released, your bond amount might be through the roof, and then you won't be able to actually afford the release. Finally, the last risk factor is our flight risk factor. If you are a transient person or a loner, then you might be deemed a flight risk. This risk factor focuses on the likelihood that you're actually going to show up to court like you say you're going to. If it's not very likely that you will show up, then you won't be released on bond. The biggest consideration here is whether or not you have significant ties to the community. If you live and work in the area that you committed the crime in, then you're probably less likely to flee. Does your family live here? Have you been living in this area long? Those are factors that they look at, but they also look to see if you have absconded before or if there are any convictions or active warrants for your failure to appear in court. If those are present, then you won't be released on bond. I have actually embedded a short video clip on Blackboard that was taken from the HBO show Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. For those of you who have had me before, you know how much I like this show and the commentary that John Oliver provides. This short clip takes a pretty good look at the pretrial bond release system in this country and the way that pretrial service officers really function. Take a look at it. It's located on Blackboard. It's a really great commentary, and it ties into what we've been talking about in this first part of lecture. So let's go ahead and now turn our attention to what happens if you are not released on bond. If you don't get released, then you have to stay in jail until your court hearing. Jail is by far not a very fun place to be. It's full of individuals who have just been arrested or who are currently serving short sentences. Either way, jails are full of individuals who might be physically sick, they're currently angry because they just got arrested, they might be withdrawing from substance use, or they're having active mental health episodes. Overall, jails are really not fun places to be, no matter how long you're there for. So let's go ahead and talk a little bit about common characteristics of jail inmates. There are some things that we know about jail inmates overall. They show indicators at a young age that might be problematic. They don't play well with others, they have anger issues, they might even have addiction issues. They engage in a lot of different criminal behaviors. They are not specialized offenders, but instead they're getting arrested and convicted for a variety of crimes. And they are a recurring figure in the jail system. Some are only in for a few days at a time. This might speak to drug offenders or alcoholics. Some are petty criminals who commit low-level offenses, and some are even homeless. You see this a lot in the wintertime, especially in colder areas where these individuals are simply trying to get out of the cold. But they show up now and again for a bit, and they get sent on their way. But because of all of these different individuals mixing together in one place, you end up with jail systems that are often overcrowded and very full. So what are jails actually for? Although jails are set up to do a variety of different functions, there has been a really strong turn lately towards holding other inmates due to overcrowding issues at prisons. When state prisons are at or over capacity, one of the things that they do is they refuse to accept any more inmates. They just don't take anybody else on. So the inmates that are supposed to be transferred have to stay in the jail system until they are accepted by the prison. This could take a couple years. Sometimes prison inmates have been actually known to serve their entire sentence at jail because they haven't yet been transferred due to overcrowding issues. Building on the revolving door theory regarding short timers, you also see that many jail inmates have current or past exposure to the system. If they were on probation or parole, they're coming back for new arrests, but also for technical violations. This further supports the idea that they are just circulating through the system at high rates. Given the statistics that are showing high rates of previous incarceration sentences that these inmates have served in the past. This follows suit with high rates of prior criminal history involving violent offenses. If we look at the social histories of these individuals, you will see that these stats suggest that jail inmates were not always raised in the most stable of environments. We know that being raised in a single-parent household is often correlated with higher levels of criminality. Additionally, having exposure to the foster care system is not always conducive to a stable, healthy adult life. If you have seen family members, specifically if you have seen a parent, become involved with the system, then you have exposed to what life is like there. Are you going to follow in the same pathway because you believe maybe this life isn't so bad? Or are you going to make a clean break and not follow down the same road as your loved one? These stats suggest that it's about a 50-50 split that you will also go to jail at some point if you have been exposed to a family member going to jail at some point. This slide actually shows data regarding jail inmates at the mid-year point of 2012. This data comes from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And these data show that most jail inmates are males, about 86-87% of them. They're also adults, nearly 100%. They're white at about 46%, and they are unconvicted at about 61%. These data support what we know about jails and what they are used for. Largely, they're used for the housing of unconvicted defendants who are still waiting to be convicted and sentenced. Furthermore, we know that there is a lot of drug and alcohol dependency floating around in jails, and not much help is being provided. It's actually very difficult to provide treatment and counseling in jails because of their short-term nature. It's very easy to dry someone out in jail. As soon as they're removed from the substance that they are dependent on, they begin to go through physical withdrawal. However, the mental dependence is still there and is still often very strong. Given the short-term nature of jails, inmates are often being released with the mental dependence that is still intact. Therefore, as soon as they are released, many of them begin using again, despite just going through the nastiness of physical withdrawal. There are a lot of issues that have to be addressed with jail inmates, including medical and health issues. Many jail inmates who enter jail also already are coming in there with medical and health issues before they enter the facility. If I'm sick before I become incarcerated, I might not have access to my meds initially. There's a lot going on during intake, and inmates might not get their medication for days before things can be straightened out. It doesn't always happen, but there have been stories where jail inmates do not get medication due to the craziness of the jail process. So if I'm asthmatic, let's say, I might not have access to my inhalers the same way I did on the outside. It takes a bit of time for the administrative issues to go through before you can begin taking your medications again regularly. So therefore, some inmates do end up dying in jails. The mortality rate is still much higher for prisons, but people do end up dying while they are in jail. But mostly they're dying of illness or suicide. Homicide rates are again much higher in prisons than they are in jail. So, going back to the same set of data that we looked at before, there were 958 jail inmate deaths that took place in 2012. The majority of the deaths were due to medical illnesses and suicide, but there were 22 that were attributed to homicide, and 21 of them were due to AIDS-related causes. If we break this down even further, we can see that as the size of the jail facility increases, so does the death count per facility. That makes sense if you think about it. The larger the jail, the more confusing things get. The larger the number of inmates, the resources are getting stretched even thinner, and inmates can be left unseen a lot more often. This slide shows the death rate of jail and prison inmate deaths. The lowest line on this slide here shows the death rate and the total number of deaths that occur in jail facilities. You will see that even though roughly 1,000 inmates died in jails in 2012, close to 3,500 have died in prison facilities. This shows that the rate in prisons is still higher than in jails. Prison inmates are incarcerated for longer periods of time, and they often die in prison before they can be released. Finally, this slide shows a total breakdown of the jail inmate deaths as we just discussed them. You will see that illness and death are two of the biggest causes of death. Illness is further broken down into different categories, with heart-related issues being the biggest illness-related factor that causes death within that category. In this lecture, we focused on the bail and bond process, and we looked at who is eligible for pretrial release and supervision. If the inmate is released on bond, then he or she will be supervised by a pretrial services officer and must follow the set conditions that the court requires the defendant to comply with. Individuals might have to put up money or collateral in order to be released on bond. If they violate the terms of their bond release, they might have the bond revoked, and that would send them back to jail. If they don't make bond, or if they are revoked, the terms of their bond are revoked, then they will stay in jail until the court hearing. While the defendant is in jail, they will be surrounded by all of the other jail inmates that are awaiting their own court hearings, including homeless defendants, those that are going through active substance withdrawal, and those that might be terminally ill. These individuals may end up spending their entire sentence in jail if their permanent prison is too crowded and unable to make the transfer with that jail. In the next lecture, we're going to be focusing primarily on diversion, and we're going to explore the options for those individuals who are not being pushed towards the criminal justice system. So I hope you join me next time when we explore Chapter 6.